This
I'm Vice
conference
President
will
at
now
FBA,
be recorded.
and I'm in my office in Halifax, and we're actually doing this session for FBA on cybersecurity and risk. We're certainly very happy to have our guest with us today, and our guest is joining us from downtown Pointe Claire in Montreal, and his name is Tom Beaupre, and he works as a partner and leader for MMP's cybersecurity team. And he's worked in the firm's payment card industry, team lead and senior member of the assessment team working out of the Montreal office. Tom helps organizations in government and industries such as retail, finance, insurance, manufacturing, IT, communications, utilities, healthcare, business services, increase security and manage risk. In today's world, everything has gone online, and obviously this is something that we're all concerned about, and obviously it's a very proper discussion for us to have today. With more than 15 years of experience, Tom assists with payment card industry scope discovery and documentation of card holder data flow, gap analysis, determine outstanding compliance points with respect to PCI and PCI networks, segregation and scope reduction. He also reviews information security policies and develops procedures, performs report compliance assessments for level 1 merchants and service providers, and delivers large complex solutions to law enforcement, higher education, and aerospace organizations. We welcome Tom to this event and thank our presenting sponsor, MMP, for helping us coordinate this important topic. So, Tom, it's all yours. Dazzle us with your computer knowledge, and we look forward to the presentation.
Okay. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. There we go. So, as Mark mentioned, I work for the cybersecurity group. I'm going to kind of run through. I'm certainly glad to accept questions either through the chat or through audio as you wish. I've prepared some material based on what I think would be of interest and what would be relevant to the FBA. Certainly adapt the conversation as we go and kind of direct. So really, it's meant to be an open conversation. I debated when I was preparing the material into exactly how much depth I would go through and whether or not I would get the people falling asleep, even though it's early in the morning and they've had coffee. So with that, here's the agenda I prepared. So I'm going to kind of run through a high-level overview of MMP and what we offer in terms of our technical services and our cyber services. And then I'm going to basically give you a primer on what is cyber, what is cybersecurity, talk about how we like to combine risk with cybersecurity. Kind of maybe give you some pointers if you're thinking about cybersecurity or concerned about it. You've heard the media reports and wondering what best do we do, how do we manage cyber or the risk, kind of give you some pointers there. Then I'll kind of run through 2 pointers. It's actually 2 case studies. One is a client of ours that is in the real estate and construction sector. They wanted to have a test done of their system, so what we call a penetration test. So I'll kind of run through some of the techniques we did and how far we were able to get into their environment. And then the second piece is it's a little bit more, the first one's kind of doom and gloom because it's kind of fairly scary. Okay, I get attacked and I'm not protected. The second one, I tried to take more of a positive note and just kind of present to you how security can enable you to take your business online. So basically, with the public health restrictions, a lot of our clients have moved some of their business online. Some of them have accelerated their plans. So I just wanted to kind of run you through some tips on how to do that from a cybersecurity perspective. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Perfect. So in case you haven't heard too much about MMP, I know we've been in the Atlantic region for a while now, or probably 3-4 years altogether. The company itself has long roots back in Canada, based out of Brandon, Manitoba initially. Based in 1958, it was founded. There was actually a couple of mergers that happened that made that happen. And eventually, the firm grew with very large ambitions to make it to basically Saskatchewan. That was the ambition. Eventually, they decided perhaps they could make it to Alberta, and then they decided, I think this is probably mid-70s, they would never go outside of Alberta. They didn't want to go into the big urban centers. It just kind of shows you their urban, their agricultural roots and the clientele they used to serve. Eventually, they swallowed their pride, went into BC, And then after that, everything fell into place, and they went into Ontario, Quebec, and then of course the Atlantic region. So currently at about and then so in the Atlantic region, just to kind of give you, I mean, we've got a really strong presence. Kurt Higgins kind of is the regional managing partner for Atlantic Canada. We now have offices in Dartmouth, Truro, Sydney, and St. John's. Over 220 members. And then about roughly in April of this year, a firm called T4G, which some of you may know, again, a very present organization in the Atlantic region, offering all kinds of IT services, branched into artificial intelligence and machine learning, basically robot, taking some robots, automating workflows. So really kind of a really good bench there, led by John Barry. So again, he's got a national responsibility for what we call M&P Digital, which is great. So we'll keep growing. Yeah, let's go to the next one. And so specifically for what we call technology solutions, we have kind of 6 pillars. We have technology advisory, customer platforms, applied data, digital enterprise, intelligent applications, and the group that I lead in part is cybersecurity and privacy. So the just to give you an idea of what that means. So if you're thinking of, say, putting your business online, you need to develop content, you need to put some of your business services online, you need to integrate with back office systems, CRM systems, enterprise risk systems, and of course, cybersecurity. So we're trying to kind of give a complete offer to the market. All right, let's move on to the next one. Right, so specifically for cybersecurity and privacy, it's a pretty broad field. So if you think of IT and all the various systems that exist and have existed over the last 30 years, we basically have to cover from a cybersecurity perspective all of their systems. So, the old mainframes, the old green screens, if any of you have ever seen those old interfaces, those things still exist in the financial world. Everything from the very first kind of interfaces, the first operating systems that existed, the smaller kind of distributed clusters, and of course, eventually Windows Server came to play, and now we've got the cloud. So basically, all of these infrastructures exist today, and all of those need to be secured. So we've got a group that we call strategy and governance, which helps organizations kind of navigate their path. So what do we do when we've got such a large, complex environment? And we've got folks that help with privacy and data protection. So of course, that's pretty self-evident, but anything that's sensitive, that's personal, names, dates of birth, health records, driving records, passports, etc. And then we've got a group that manages security. So we have an offer where for certain clients, we'll manage their alerts. So providing 7/24 responsiveness in case there's a security incident. We also have a team that will specifically do an analysis if there is a breach and there are either internal fraud or an external breach, and there's a possibility of having to go to court or engage with law enforcement. So we have a team that does that. And I guess we also try and have fun as much as we can. It's been a challenge through COVID. I think, however, in the last week, I've done 3 of these virtual events, and we do virtual events as well. Like as a team, we try to have fun. So we did a murder mystery last week, which was a lot of fun. We did a virtual escape where we're actually controlling a person in a room, which was kind of challenging because, if you've ever done an escape game, typically you can move things around, inspect things. So we actually had to guide a real person in the actual escape room to try and get out. So that was quite interesting. And on the right, you've got some of our larger clients. In Atlantic Canada, we've been around as an organization, kind of serving clients for about 20 years there. So we've done work for a number of some of the governments, some of the cities, and also some manufacturers out there. All right, so let's go on to the next one. All right, so yeah, we can go on to the next one. Right, so I guess this is what we call the scary part of cybersecurity, the headline grabbers. There's a website called World's Biggest Data Breaches, if you ever want to go and consult it. It has a pretty good kind of heat map of breaches over the last, I think it goes back till about 2008, I think, is some of their data. And you can kind of see over time the breaches. And the conclusion to draw from this is it's very prevalent. It's happening all the time. Even well-protected organizations still do get breaches. And the statistics are pretty alarming. About 55% of organizations have had a cyber attack. A lot of people would leave an organization if they think their details were used by a criminal. Sometimes you don't have a choice. We all have only probably one local government, one provincial government. It's pretty hard to leave. They have your data. There's not much you can do about it. And I'll come back to that in a little second as well. And usually the motivation is financial. So espionage also plays a secondary factor. We see some of that in some of our manufacturing client, where their intellectual property, their processes, or their intellectual secrets are being targeted by cyber attackers. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Oh, you skipped a lot there. Yeah, all right. So I thought I'd kind of bring this one up. So this one is one of the larger Canadian breaches that happened last year. So Desjardins announced initially that one employee had access potentially to a number of accounts. It wasn't revealed exactly what control failed, but one employee should not have had access to this much information. How did this employee get the information? None of those details have really surfaced, but in the end, basically, they're at about a loss of about $70 million for those records that were breached. There's a fair amount of sensitive information, which included names, addresses, birth dates, social insurance numbers, and also some information on their transaction details. So most likely this information was accessed by somebody that they think was in the marketing department. So somebody that normally would launch campaigns for selling products and services to their clientele. Should not have happened. I think this one's going to play out in either the legislature or in the courts in Quebec. So we'll see how that one plays out over the years. And yeah, then on to the next one. Right. So also, there's been some breaches involving Nova Scotia government. The thing to note is, people think about the government and my information. Where is it? Well, the reality is it's in a number of departments, offices, ministries. So your information may be in several places, and those all of those systems are not protected at the same level. There's legacy, there's departments that have stood up in infrastructure that is still in place. So it's an ongoing challenge for all levels of government to try and implement proper safeguards to protect the information. All right, let's go on to the next one. Perfect. Okay, so usually what I'm trying to kind of describe here is, what is an attacker going for? In the end, they're going for money. And sometimes some of these firms specialize on what they can monetize. So some of them specialize, say, for instance, on credit card data. So there's an open market. If you go to the dark web and you wanted to do a search and you wanted to say, find credit cards in Nova Scotia, and you wanted to have a gold card, a Visa card, you could do that kind of search and you could purchase that information online. So there's, that market is very mature. The rates have gone down. The hackers are complaining because basically the value of the data is going down, but there's markets available for that. So that's a very mature one. Less mature ones which are more targeted are things around like intellectual property, like I mentioned before, so trade secrets, processes, customer lists, strategic plans. That's usually more of a targeted attack. So we see that being used by competitors often. So somebody's wondering, how is somebody able to manufacture? I'll give you an example. Somebody has a intellectual properties that they've developed to make vinyl softer and appear like leather. So that's a very valuable knowledge that they've gained through decades of research and testing and experimentation. And this particular client was concerned that Chinese actors were trying to grab that trade secret. So basically, that was an interesting project. So, sometimes it's very targeted. Sometimes it's just what we call a flyby. So they basically they scan the internet constantly. They find a certain target. So it could be an insurance company. They just find a mid-sized insurance company that's vulnerable, and they just try and go in. And I'll talk about some of the techniques they use in a second. But basically, they just try and go in and extract that information and basically either ask for ransom or threaten to disclose it on the internet. All right, let's go on to the next one. So one thing that I hear often is, we're a smaller organization. Why would they target at us? A lot of this thing is just automated. So they have robots constantly crawling the web, and they basically they're just looking for targets, easy targets. So usually what they'll find on a single PC is, again, personal information. So what they usually do for that is identity theft is what their target is. So they're trying to basically either order goods under your name, get government issued ID, or sometimes they'll ask for credit cards to be issued or credit lines to be issued using somebody else's identity. We've also seen some fairly sophisticated attacks where they basically will produce identity. So they'll basically get enough information to produce what looks like a government issued card. They'll go to your local bank and they'll try and extract basically all the funds or substantial funds from your accounts. A recent one that we saw was it's kind of a complicated attack that we saw, but basically what they did is they took a credit card, put in a check, a valid check, into the account balance on the credit card, which was about $40,000, went to a shop, bought $40,000 worth of goods, and before that transaction cleared, withdrew the money from the bank teller again by presenting fake ID. And so that one was, it was basically exploiting a time of processing from a time of clearing in the financial system. So that was a very interesting ruse, and apparently it was used across North America. So, they find out a hole in the system, they find out a hole in the controls, and they try and exploit it on a large scale. There's numerous examples of that. Yeah, perfect. So, so I don't know if any of you are, thinking about your business and, what do I do about cybersecurity? Why does it matter? So in the end, really, it's about, clients in your brand. That's about, this is the most important, and probably a secondary factor is around compliance. So, your clients, you basically, some of them will they'll ask for some sort of assurance, are you protecting my data? Is my data safe? And you may also be considering that you want to leverage the web and get new clients that way, solicit new clients, also accept electronic payments to reduce your internal overhead costs. So those are all kind of important factors. The brand, of course, if you get hacked, it does give you notoriety. People know about you, they hear about you, sometimes not in a good way. And usually, there is some impact to the brand. And if customers have an option, as you saw before, some people will choose to go elsewhere. There's also, if you're accepting specific types of data like credit cards, if there's a breach, there will be fines, there'll be penalties, and they may also disallow you from accepting credit cards. So a recent example was a fairly known hotel chain, but there were 3 franchised hotel locations of this chain, and the owner basically got hacked. And they were not able to protect their systems, and Visa disallowed credit cards from being accepted for their establishment. So they could clients could no longer pay with their Visa either in person or make reservations online. So that was a significant impact to this hotel operator. On the compliance side, some of these things are laws, some of these things are regulations, some of them are standards. So it's important to know, depending on the type of data that you have in the business that you operate in, what is my responsibility? There are some national requirements around disclosure. So there was a law passed in November of 2019. So any breach in your organization of sensitive data, you're supposed to declare. I think it's not being enforced, but the law, it does exist. All right, so let's go on to the next one. So some of the questions you may have is, what's our most important assets? What are my concerns? What should I be concerned about? What are my key risks? Are we spending enough or not enough on cyber? Are we keeping up with the threats, and how best to manage basically the risks? So yeah, let's go on to the next one. Right. So, so I mean, a lot of people think that technology will solve all the issues, and it does. It is very fundamental to your cybersecurity. Just think of a password. If you didn't have a password, how easy it would be to get into your account. And basically, technology does solve a lot of the problems. The issue is people forget about the training. So we've all seen the phishing attempts kind of mature over the years. Initially, it was, a Nigerian prince claiming that if you sent them $100, you would get $1 million to get them out of jail or whatever the scam was. So some of that still exists, strangely enough, but usually it's quite sophisticated. So you do need to train your people. And when we call risk, it's basically if your people are not trained and are not aware of cybersecurity or not protecting information, then that's obviously a risk. So you have to think about, if my system was compromised, if I didn't have access to my system whatsoever, which typically happens in a ransomware attack, how would I operate? So I'll give you another example. We have a manufacturer that had operations in Canada, the US, and Mexico. The attackers got into their systems and they basically looked around for a couple of weeks. They figured out how their payroll was done. They figured out how their bank accounts were set up. They figured out where their big clients were. And then there was they waited till a perfect storm. So they basically waited till this client had to make a payment. There was a tranche due and they had to make a large payment on the loan they had. And they also had a big client delivery that was scheduled for this particular week. And what they did is, it was a long weekend. Saturday morning, they launched a ransomware. All the systems across all 3 countries were shut down. So no access whatsoever to any account, any system. So they couldn't start up their manufacturing. They couldn't pay this outstanding loan. And of course, the client was expecting delivery of product. So unfortunately, in that case, they had to pay a very large ransom because they didn't have backups. They had to pay a very large ransom to get their operations up and running again. And they had no certainty that the hackers weren't still in the systems. They did all the cleanup they could, but because they had to rush to get their manufacturing going, they still had that little niggling doubt. Fortunately for them, I suppose, these hackers were what we call fairly reputable hackers. So once they got paid the ransom, which was in the 7 digits, they didn't attack them again. So they take their money and then they move on to the next target. All right, right. So that was kind of the point about reversibly damaging. So if you're thinking about cyber, you really got to think about some goals. You're trying to basically reduce the potential for incidents and disclosure because these things will happen. It could be a minor. If you've got really good systems, it'll be minor. It'll be detected quickly and what we call contained very quickly. So you'll find what the issue is and contain it to a few servers, a few workstations. If you don't have very good detection systems, it could propagate throughout your organization, as was the case for that manufacturer. So in that case, it's a complete shutdown of all systems, all operations. Typically, you've got alerts. Most monitoring software nowadays is intelligent enough to detect when something unusual is happening. There's the old antivirus, which still kind of works for certain attacks, but for really sophisticated attacks, it is still able to detect it, but somebody needs to be watching the alerts. And what we're finding is today, that's one of the weakest point in kind of mid-sized businesses is nobody's looking at the alerts. So just think of, you've got an alarm on your house, the alarm goes off, but nobody's monitoring it. Not much point in having an alarm if nobody's there to take action. So same thing for your systems. You need 7/24 coverage for it to be effective. We also think it's important to align with your business mission. So, obviously if you're a bank or a financial institution, security, you can't afford to have any breach. So you may spend a little bit more. You definitely need to meet the laws and the regulations. And the important thing is just basically to know what your risk factors are. So what's my biggest risk? My biggest risk so I've got some clients that are manufacturing, they say, it doesn't really matter if all of my servers got wiped tomorrow, as long as I didn't lose my intellectual property, I could just restart most of my servers and not really lose information. I don't have stored information. If you're a company that has a long client list, so I'll give you an example that happened recently in the Montreal area. There's a pool installation company. So they typically do most of their business, of course, in the summer months. And so the hackers got into their systems in the winter, and they were just sat and waited until, they had a whole list of clients for pool installations, pool maintenance, etc. And they waited till just the peak of the season when it was about to start, and they locked all their systems. So basically, this company didn't know who their clients were, didn't know what the jobs were supposed to be. So basically, again, unfortunately, they didn't have very good backups, so they have to pay the attackers to resume their operations. So, sometimes they'll be very patient, the hackers. So if you know, so it's something to watch out for, I guess, if you know you've got peaks and troughs in your business. So for instance, say if you're a ski hill operator and you know the busy season is coming, it would make sense to be extra vigilant before the start of the season just to watch for very unusual behavior. And of course, the last bit is just adapting to a changing landscape. The attacks are changing. People are moving to the cloud a lot more, so that's a different type of an attack technique. And if you're like a large number of organizations in Canada, a lot of people are working from home. So people are working remotely. It's a different work environment. People are more likely to use personal devices to log into enterprise or your organization. And that's also a risk because people tend to copy documents locally. So we've seen a lot of our clients, for instance, with call centers, have to move their operations to basically 100% from home in Ontario and Quebec and a couple of other locations. So the challenge of that is the controls weren't there. So the voice could be intercepted. Some of the workstations were not secure. Call center agents were making copies of documents locally on their devices. So, very hard to monitor those things when it's remote. Okay, so I had two case studies. I don't know if there's any questions here before I get into the case studies, or I haven't been monitoring the chat at all, but it looks like we don't have any. So again, don't hesitate to ask questions. So I've got kind of two case studies. One is in the real estate and construction sector, and it's what we call penetration testing. So this client, fairly large operator of properties, they manage properties, they build properties, office towers mainly, but also some shopping malls. And they have pretty good systems. They had a fairly mature security program, but they just wanted to see if I was a hacker, would I be able to get into our systems? Oh, okay. Social engineering. Oh, good question. So the question is, is it fair to say the easiest entry is social engineering? It's certainly the easiest one is just to have somebody provide their password. That's the easiest. So there, believe it or not, there are dark websites where if you are you work for a certain company, people will pay you money for your password. So that's kind of the easiest one. So basically, they set up a website. Let's say you work for, I'll just pick whatever, one of the big 5 banks, and you're a system administrator. They will pay you like money in Bitcoin to provide your username and your password. So that's probably the easiest. But obviously, most people are trustworthy, so that doesn't work very well. So the second one is just exploiting a vulnerability. So in the systems, if there are vulnerabilities, and that's what I'm going to talk about here in a second, if you can exploit that, then you don't really need to go through the step of monitoring the session, putting out a phishing email that says click here for the link or the latest news on whatever COVID or Trump. But definitely phishing is effective, but usually the target, it depends what your end goal is. If you want to compromise an end workstation, relatively straightforward. If you want to get to the crown jewels, where most of the data is, usually it's the first step. So, but it is definitely a technique. Right. Okay. Very good question. All right. So let's go on to the next slide. So the client asked us to basically try and get into their systems. So we did as any attacker would do. We did a scan of their environment. So just using tools, from internet-based tools, nothing special, no special privileges, no knowledge of the client. So we basically just ran a scan, and we discovered that they were using Cisco infrastructure, which is quite common. And there's this thing called IPMI, basically, which is an interface for getting into Cisco equipment. And we discovered there was a critical vulnerability possible. So we did a scan. Yeah, next one. Next slide. Yeah. So we did a scan, and it's kind of like, okay, it looks like it's accepting requests. So it also looked like it was not running the right, it was running the right version of Cisco software for us to be able to exploit it. So then we issued a command to the next one. Yeah. So we issued the command. It looked like it was able to run. So they did the next step in the exploit, which is very easy. We basically put in a false password and to see if we could get a response. Yeah, go on to the next one. And so we're able to get what is called a hash. This is not the hash that the Trudeau government has legalized. So this is it's a mathematical function, and what it does is it converts your password into a series of random digits. So you see kind of a bunch of them there, but usually it's anywhere from 256 to 512 random hexadecimal characters. So your password is stored in a system as this encrypted cryptogram, as we call it. So based on that, you would think, okay, what do I do with that? So unless I know the encryption algorithm and I can crack it, I won't be able to figure out what it is. So then we ran it through, next page, one of our tools. So just to figure out, okay, let's just assume that it's probably 8 digits, and let's try and do what is called a rainbow table lookup. So rainbow table lookup is a list of common passwords that are used by people. So if anybody uses password as a password, of course, any rainbow table would have that. So rainbow table is pre-computed values. So you already know the answer to the puzzle effectively. So we did that test, it didn't work. So then we went to the next step. Next slide, yeah. So we have in our lab what we call the hashinator. So it's a specially built piece of hardware that allows us to crack passwords. And so what you see there is just assuming if you've got a good strong password that's a combination of upper and lowercase letters, digits, and special characters, and you assume an 8-digit password length. So our machine can crack those passwords in 2 days or less typically. So if it's a fairly straightforward password, we could crack it. So yeah, so we ran it, and we were prepared to wait 2 days, but after 2 seconds, it was able to crack the password. So unfortunately, this one wasn't a very complex password, so we were able to crack it very quickly. Then, yeah, so that led us to basically access to their full infrastructure. So from this outside, no prior knowledge of this client other than we knew the client name, we're able to get into their system. So I'm just gonna take a sip of water here. No, so go back. So yeah, go back one. Yeah. So basically, yeah, the full infrastructure one. Yeah, one more. One more. One more. Yeah, the infrastructure. Yeah, keep going. The infrastructure bit. Oh.
We're going back or forward? Sorry.
Oh, forward to the
Oh,
infrastructure. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's basically, because they were using a virtualized infrastructure, that gave us access to pretty much all of their servers. So this is the servers that are used for managing their office towers, some of the shopping malls. So when you think about all the systems that are tied into those, it could be pretty damaging. So then we figured, okay, let's see if some of these are unprotected. And so we go to the next page. Right. So yeah, we found basically access to all the video cameras. So once we had access to the video cameras, we tried to dig a little deeper and see what we could do, and we could actually stop the video cameras because some of them were recording. So we could delete footage, we could change footage, we could do whatever we wanted on the footage. We also had access to floor plans, as you see. So we knew the locations of the cameras, we knew the locations of the doors, we knew which, they also had access systems for, the old badge readers. So we're able to control those. And yeah, next page. And then we also had access to the HVAC system. So, I mean, maybe in the winter it wouldn't be too pleasant to turn down the temperature or raise the temperature. But typically, some of our clients are in the agricultural business, and if you're able to get into the HVAC system and turn off some of the environmental controls, it could really damage the crops for some of these greenhouse grows. So pretty much a full compromise of their system. From start to finish, that one was a couple of hours. And so it really depends on the attacker and how much time they're willing to invest to get into systems. Some of the hackers obviously constantly trying to get into the big targets, the banks, the governments. So they may chip away at it for days, weeks, or months to try and successfully exploit the vulnerabilities and get into the systems. But this one was pretty straightforward. A couple of hours, we're able to get full control of their systems. So obviously they decided that they needed to do a little bit better, and we give them a recommendation on some of the things they needed to do. So I don't know if there's any questions on the pen testing there. So that was kind of the doom and gloom story. All right, so the next one's hopefully a little bit more positive. So basically, if you're thinking about taking your business online, I thought I would talk about how to, some tips and some considerations on how to secure it from both a cyber, so the systems perspective, and also ensuring that you've got the right systems in place to prevent fraud. All right, so let's go to the next one. Perfect. Right. So I think it's pretty obvious that the online market is hot, especially now. I think more and more people are depending on online for what used to be kind of, maybe fringe purchase. A lot of more people now are relying on online shopping for clothing, which is a really, really hot market. Books, strangely enough, I would think more ebooks, but books as well. Electronics, music, of course, downloads, etc. Government services, some of them are paid. So if you're thinking about, say, a fishing license, those kinds of things, some government services are also available online. Flights, of course, most people do book, I'd say, online, majority of Canadians now, but there's significant growth. Game tickets, which of course is a market that has more or less disappeared. With the restrictions, household goods, even durable goods, movies, videos, etc. So a lot of growth, and there's the numbers. I think we're gonna be over 47 billion. So the expectation is with the restrictions that online shopping is going to have grown at least 20% above that number. So we're probably looking at closer to like $60 billion. And pretty much, we're on track for where the global trend is. So, 15% of all purchasing is done online. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Right. So you basically see some more trends here. I mean, it's not quite a hockey stick trend, but it's pretty close to it. So that this market is going to continue to grow. So if you've been sitting on the sidelines thinking about how do I take my business online, how do I benefit from an online presence, I think the time to act is now. We have I'll give you an example. We have a retailer who is in the, let's say, luxury goods segment. They're pre-pandemic, kind of say 2019, their online sales were maybe 10% of the total. When the pandemic restriction hit, they decided to close all of their retail locations across the country. So their online became their only source of revenue. So they invested as soon as they could to kind of grow their capability, their offer. They did a bunch of things around, recognizing loyalty programs, those kinds of things. And they were able to kind of grow, double their online sales, which is, to about 20%. So basically, they were able to grow that over a period of about 3 months. So they did invest in it, made it a little bit more attractive, made sure it was secure, and it paid off for them. If they'd acted a little bit sooner, maybe they could have done a little bit better. But their stores have reopened now progressively. But the challenge, of course, is they depended a lot on tourists coming into Canada. Basically in the main cities, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and places like Halifax, Calgary, also got a fair amount of business. But so if they'd acted a little bit earlier, it would have been a little bit better for them. So yeah, so on to the next one. So what I want to do here was just kind of show some of the if you are thinking about getting into the online business, it's not just about having a digital commerce platform. So you probably, maybe many of you have heard about Shopify. So Shopify, in 3 clicks or less, allows you to set up an online shop. So you'll be able to kind of post products, put a price. You'll be able to kind of, fulfill the demand. But really, if you want to kind of drive that to any significant degree, you need to build in some business intelligence and automate certain things. So you may want to automate the shipping. You may want to automate some of the fulfillment pieces if you're working through parties and you're not providing the full product yourself. And you also want to look at, what is this client buying? What do they like to buy? How do I get them to buy more from my shop? So there's, the whole aspect of analytics. And of course, at the bottom, the piece that I hold a little bit more near and dear to my heart is the whole security and compliance bit, and also getting into payments and fraud detection. So this is ensuring that the payment flow is secure and making sure that you're not getting defrauded. So I'll give you an example of what tends to happen to some merchants when they first set up online. If the security is not proper, the hackers will, when they steal a lot of credit cards, they want to validate that the cards are still valid. So they will basically go to some of the smaller online merchants and pretend to do a purchase using a stolen credit card. Oh, sorry, is there a question there? No? Oh, okay. Another question. Okay, sorry, I think I was skipping ahead. Can I trust the security of the router provided by my SP? If not, are there easy things I can put in place? That's a good question. There's very basic controls. So first of all, the routers themselves, nowadays most of the ISPs do update them, which wasn't the case a while back. So basically, they used to have no means of updating the software in the router. Typically, that's much better now. They've also built in some capability around making sure that the Wi-Fi connectivity is secure. So that's typically one of the issues. I mean, not as much anymore, but that was an attack vector. People would just sit next to a Wi-Fi hotspot, whatever that was, a hotel or a residence, and they would try and basically hack into your system that way. But basically, if you look at the basic security protocol built into routers, it's pretty permissive. They don't want to block or restrict your access. So that's really, if you want to have security, you need some sort of means of filtering what you're going to the internet to do. And there are some free services that exist. So the Canadian industry that monitors domain names, they do offer free software for your mobile devices. So it's called Canadian Shield. So that will actually filter where you're trying to access to the internet. And it's kind of interesting to turn it on, even if you don't want to use it. I can send the link a little bit later on after this. So it's a piece of software you install on your mobile device. And if you try and hit a website that looks legitimate, it'll look to see where that website is linked to. So it's kind of like a free URL filtering solution. But I strongly recommend whatever you do, if you've got PCs at home, to get a really, splurge a little bit and get the best antivirus, anti-malware software. They're usually about $50, $60, not the $20 version, and they'll give you better protection, certainly for your PC. So, right, okay, so access from the outside. So I don't know if you're thinking like somebody actually attacking your router. So obviously, if Bell, so I'll give you an example of Bell. So Bell used to use the same password for all the routers. So if you're one of the technicians, you had access to all the routers. They've changed that now, so it's a little bit more intelligent. So you typically need a certificate-based workstation, so something that has a pre-shared secret to log into the routers, but not all ISPs have that. So yeah, it is quite possible, depending on your ISP provider, that they've got a standard password, in which case you could go in and change the password yourself. So there are, if you do a little bit of research, or you call in, you say, I want to change the password, at least you'll have that layer of security. But I would say if your router is one of the older model, like three to 4 years, and maybe you should ask for a more recent router, because some of them definitely had security issues, which have served for attacks. So I mean, usually, maybe I'll answer a question that wasn't asked, but if you're concerned about your router at home, usually what they're trying to get at is most likely your PC to launch attacks. So like what's called a distributed denial of service attack. They'll try and attack the servers, mainframes, etc., from your IP address. So therefore, concealing their identity. So sometimes they're just trying to take over control of your workstations or your PCs to launch attacks. We don't often, we don't often see attacks of individuals through their routers. But again, it depends. Some communities, they're just trying to build up a botnet. So they may decide I need 1,000 workstations to launch this attack. They may decide, okay, whatever. I'm not going to pick on anybody, but say ExploreNet. So ExploreNet has 5,000 of these types of routers. I know what their passwords are, and they'll try and go in and get control of the assets behind those routers. All right, so yeah, let's go on to the next one. Yeah, did we lose Sarah or? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so if you're thinking about launching an online business, obviously you need to accept pretty much every type of payment that exists out there. And today of course, everyone's heard of Visa, MasterCard, and Interact. There's also emerging technologies. There's Apple Pay, there's Google Pay. There's a number of, even PayPal has been around for a long time. Most of the transactions for credit cards, of course, use the familiar 16-digit character. And really, there's a number of standards that apply. And basically, if you start accepting credit cards, you are responsible for securing to this standard. So even though it's not obvious, maybe nobody's asking you to demonstrate compliance. If there's ever a breach, that's when you get the call. Kind of similar to the hotel example I was giving you before. This particular franchise owner wasn't aware that they needed to be compliant for PCI. And they found out, the hard way once they were hacked, that they were responsible. Right, so let's go on to the next one. So this is kind of how a typical transaction works. So, there's the card holder, the person who actually holds the card. There's the issuing bank. So say Scotiabank as an example. So Scotiabank issues a Visa. Then there's a number of what we call the payment brand network, but basically there's a large number of intermediaries. So that could be the merchant, your local coffee shop where you go and put in the card. That card number gets routed into the payment network, which could be some gateways, some clearing houses. Eventually it ends up into the acquirer, of course, the person who's actually going to process the card and do the settlement. And there's money that gets exchanged between that acquirer and the merchant. And it's the acquirer, you may not even know what that company is. So maybe some of you have heard, say, of Moneris or TD Bank Services. So in the background, when you go to your local coffee shop, if you look at the terminal, sometimes it'll show TD or it'll show Moneris. So that is actually the acquirer. So the transaction, that merchant is getting paid by that company for the transaction. And then they go and settle with your issuing bank. Right, so let's go on to the next one. So, so when you're trying to kind of build this one's maybe I'm getting too much in the weeds here, but so this is kind of like a couple of examples of how you could take a credit card and do an online shopping. So usually you've got a checkout cart and you basically say, okay, I want to purchase the following goods. And when you press enter, there's a number of ways that payment can be made. So depending on how you set up your website has a huge impact to the security that needs to be put in place. And so the simplest one is what we call a redirect. So if any of you, most of you have looked at purchase something online, and you look, sometimes you'll go to accept payment or make payment. All of a sudden you're redirected, and there's a new page that appears. Sometimes there's a new address at the top. So what's happened there is your browser has been redirected to another merchant or another entity. to process the transaction. So that's usually the simplest and cheapest way to set up electronic commerce. If you don't do that, let's go on to the next one. The next one is where that merchant, let's say it's a online goods for bicycle supplies. So that merchant will have set up they'll capture some information internally before submitting it. So in that case, the address doesn't change. So you'll notice that the address at the top hasn't changed. So that's kind of a little bit more. And then the next one. Yeah. And so the API is basically, they're basically doing a call, an open system call over the internet to the acquirer. So this is the most complex one to secure because the application itself knows the credit card number. It's processed in its memory, and basically everything is in scope. So that's the worst. So let's go to the next one. The next, yeah. Correct. So basically, for the standard, the security standard that you have to adhere to if you're handling credit cards, there's a questionnaire that needs to be filled out. So if you use the first one where you're just being redirected, you only have about 22 security controls, which are very basic. So, your time and efforts can be very simple, so very easy. So I recommend for any small business to really use the redirect, and really only medium and large merchants to use the other techniques. So I'll give you an example. We have a company that does leasing, long-term leasing for cars, and they decided they wanted their web page to look a certain way for their clientele. They wanted full control over the flow. They wanted to keep the look and feel a certain way. So they decided to kind of do an API call. And unfortunately, they after 6 months of trying, they decided, okay, this is way too much from a security perspective. I made a mistake. I should have just done a redirect and go with that. And so they had to reverse course. So basically, the whole project was delayed by about a year. So they did the planning, they built it, they tried to secure it. They had it running for about 6 months. After another 6 months, they decided we just can't get there. We're just too many security issues. They were failing their pen tests, as I showed you how the technique was before. So they have to roll back all their development. So if you are considering going online, really just go for the simplest redirect option for sure. Okay. Any questions? I'll just check. Right. Okay. So the next bit is more around, again, if you are online, you just need to be aware of potential cyber frauds, because if you set up an online business and there's fraud on your portal, then there's going to be chargebacks. Right. So let's go on to the next one. Right. So so basically, if you think about potential sources of fraud, so there's usually a number of ways of placing an order. You'll be online. You may use a mobile device. Some people may kind of have the option to call in, so you kind of get through some of the steps, but then you can call in and you can request refunds. So so it's really important to have some back office systems monitoring for fraud, right? So let's go to the next one. Yeah. Right. So this is some high level recommendation. I'm going to kind of go through some of the tools, but from the best practice. So basically, obviously, you need to monitor what's coming through on your online business. So if you're a company that normally does a certain volume of business and all of a sudden it goes up, that might be suspicious. If somebody tries to make very small purchases, let's say you have you sell a service and you offer gift cards online. We had this issue where somebody was able to exploit a vulnerability in the gift cards. So they would order a $100 gift card, but they'd only have to pay $10. So there was basically a flaw in the logic. They could manipulate the messages, and basically the $10 charge was actually a shipping charge, which was strange enough. So they were able to compromise the system by exploiting the logic of the website. So obviously you need to do training of staff, and if for any large transactions, you need to kind of go that extra step for sure. And there are programs available. So you've probably heard, or you may not have heard, but Visa has a secured by Visa. So they've got an extra step that validates the address of the person. So, additional bits of information that you may have seen when you're doing online purchases, right? So let's do one more. Right. So, of course, if you're doing online transactions, you really need to make sure that your security code is part of the transaction. And actually, I would recommend if you go to a website and they don't ask for the security code, they're probably not a secure website. So I would probably not use them if you have the choice. So of course, the risk is higher because there's nobody physically present. You don't have to put the card in front of somebody. So you can't actually scan the chip on the card, and there's no PIN, right? So of course, the level of risk is much higher. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so this is, it's a rather busy kind of little chart, but and I'm not saying that if you're first going online that you should put in all of these kind of techniques, but typically, if you're accepting online transactions, so some of the larger organizations, they will track a large number of parameters just to make sure that's not fraud. So obviously they'll check for the very basic one is what we call a velocity check. So they'll look for when was the last time this card was used and where. So was it used from a PC, say in Halifax, and then 5 minutes later it's used by a PC somewhere in the US or in Europe, or China would be an obvious one, but so basically, is it used? Does it make sense? Could somebody have traveled during that time or not? And you look for suspicious kind of $0 transactions as well. So an example of that is I registered for a free course a couple of days ago. So it was $0, it was a US-based company. So that was fine. The bank allowed that one to go through. Then I updated that same card on my Apple wallet about 5 minutes later, and I got flagged by, of course, the fraud detection technique saying, why are there 2 suspicious transactions within a small time window? So they sent me a message saying, it looks like there's been fraud on your card, can you call us? So that's kind of an example. Another thing that we see for mobile payments as well, are many of you familiar with Square? I don't know if you've seen Square, but so what Square does is they'll actually, because it's a mobile device, they'll look at the physical location of the merchant. And so they'll look at, if you're a taxi driver, could a taxi driver have driven that fast with this device that quickly? So they're tracking both the merchant and the mobile device and the credit card number to make sure that it is physically possible to move across physical barriers that quickly. They'll also look for things like, is there consistency in your browser? So if a client logs in one day with a Windows machine, if they log in with what the hackers really like, which is like a Linux or Ubuntu type of operating system, does that make sense? So if you go into your banking website, you probably would have noticed that it says, accept the cookies. And what they're doing when you're accepting the cookies, they're putting in basically a piece of information on your workstation in your browser's cache that says, I've accessed this website on this day, and they validate that. So they'll check the next time you log in, is this the same PC as before? It's the same operating system, everything is good. And if it's not, most of them now do flag, they'll say, do you use this PC often, or are you traveling? They'll ask you a couple of questions. And of course, basic things around shipping addresses. So again, I'll give you another example. So we have a company that it's an online business, about $30 million in business. They sell printer ink cartridges online. So they had a large amount of fraud to postal box office. So they were ordering goods using stolen cards, which doesn't look like the best way of making money, but they're using stolen cards to have product shipped to a post office box, which was known to be used by criminal gangs. And basically they were shipping all these goods, and then once the delivery was made, they were reselling the goods. So if you're trying to protect yourself from that, Canada Post does have what they call a blacklist. So like known addresses that are used by these scammers, they do maintain it. And they obviously they are the authority, of course, for the real addresses that exist with postal codes and et cetera. So, so Canada Post definitely has some plugins as well. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. So the last, I guess I've got a couple more here. So in terms of some of the techniques, so you set transaction floors and limits. So don't just set up your online portal to allow any kind of amount, any kind of quantity. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. So anything over whatever your threshold is for risk, don't accept an order for whatever 1,000 t-shirts if you normally kind of sell one or twos. It doesn't make sense. There's something suspicious there. You make sure that you, of course, you always ask for the security code. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. Yeah, so you kind of be cognizant of kind of brute force replay attacks. So if somebody tries to let's say they make a transaction and then your system detects that same transaction is attempted a short time later, it's probably they're trying to figure out a flaw in your application. So they're just modifying the message slightly and trying to exploit a vulnerability in your system. So that's definitely important. And if you can, of course, track the geographic location. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. So again, IP blacklisting and whitelisting is similar to what the banks do. So the financial institutions, every time you log into their website, they'll track your IP address, your operating system, and your browser. So they'll track all three of those things, and then of course they'll track your username and your password. And if you've got two-factor, they'll track that as well. But what they do with that is they're establishing a profile. So this person, okay, normally works probably here. They don't know if you're working, but they know your IP address. They go, okay, it's from a downtown office. It's this IP address. When you're home, usually it's an IP address from this range, which, to the gentleman's question before, comes from your router. So, they know the point of access. So they're kind of what we're doing is called IP whitelisting. So they're building a list of known good IP addresses. And of course, they're blocking constantly known bad IP addresses, typically from Eastern Europe and China, of course. Most of those are blocked, but not all. And of course, if you're traveling, and you've ever tried to get into your financial institution website, it's a little bit more challenging. You'll probably have to go through some additional steps there. Yep, let's go on to the next one. Yeah, I think I'll just touch on maybe the alert. So really, an alert is really important. So whoever you choose to kind of put your transactions through, they should alert you right away if something's suspicious. Similarly to if you're the card holder, you get a message. This looks a little bit odd. Why is this happening? The merchant should also receive the same thing. Like, this transaction looks suspicious. You should investigate and maybe not ship the product, for instance. Okay, yeah, that's good. And I think that was it. So I'm just going to check to see. Is there one more question? Okay. Oh, there we go. So Craig's got full of questions here. So two-factor authentication touts higher security. Does it true that someone gains access to my phone? They can reset the password on all my accounts. Present increased risks. Yeah. So yeah, very good question. Let me have a sip of water and I'll give you a 3-minute answer after. Hold on a second. So we had a client recently. It's an organization that deals in cryptocurrencies. So basically, they built an environment for exchanging cryptocurrencies, and as you can imagine, they are targeted by hackers because the hackers love cryptocurrencies. So basically, there are 3 people that had the access to the root accounts, and all of them had two-factor access. And all of them had two-factor on their mobile device. So so basically that's the first part, just setting the stage. So what the attackers did is they tried a couple of different techniques. So the first one was social engineering. They basically just called the person and said they were from a financial institution and they needed to validate certain information. So the person did not obviously provide any sensitive information. And just kind of thought that was odd. The second attempt, they did a little bit better. So they're able to exploit a vulnerability in one of the applications on the phone, and they're able to basically get some control of some of the media. So when you think about the apps, sometimes there's that little checkbox. do I share my contents? Do I share my contacts, my calendar, events, etc.? So the app that was compromised allowed them to get access to the contacts. And so they were able to send emails to some of their contacts and figure out who their contacts were and kind of launch email attacks. So basically, hey, how's it going? I need access. So basically they figured out, they tried to infiltrate the organization and get contacts. So that was unsuccessful. So the hackers were undeterred. So what they decided to do is pull out all the stops, and they basically did a SIM swap. So a SIM swap, so if you've got, you got a mobile device, all of them have a little chip similar to what it's a very small memory card. Basically, it sits on your mobile device. So they went to the local mobile carrier and said, my phone doesn't work. I'd like to swap out the phone, and could I do that, please? And so they said, sure. And they said, oh, actually, I've got an old phone here. Can I use this phone? And then they asked a couple of security questions. The person knew the security questions, and so they gave them a new SIM. Once they had the new SIM, basically this was now the trusted device. So with that, they were able to basically now access to the second factor. So that was a kind of pretty extreme example, but once they had access to the second factor, the first thing they did was drain all the available funds that were liquid. So they got some access to some cryptocurrencies that way, but they weren't able to get into the core operating system because they needed 2 people to get in at the same time. So at least this company had the right controls in place. But yeah, so in the payments world, I'll just conclude with this kind of last little bit. So in the payments world, to have a secure 2-factor, it needs to be separate from the device you're logging in with. So just to say that another way. So if you're logging into like a payment network, you would log in with, let's say, a PC, and the second factor is on a second device. So the idea behind that is you have to compromise 2 devices to be able to get in, because the mobile phones, while they are secure and the operating systems themselves are secure, they are getting updates as vulnerabilities are being discovered, and so that's always something that needs to be done. And also, the main challenge with the mobile devices is there are millions of apps. So basically, if you look at Google and Apple, they have robots and algorithms that look for known security issues and they block those apps. But the attackers are finding vulnerabilities all the time in the operating systems. So there's some well-known cases of apps that revealed, all the passwords of the users, got access to all the contacts, etc. And some of them had full control over the operating system. So definitely, mobile devices are great. They're convenient, but they're not secure. They're relatively secure, but they're not 100% secure. So my guidance would be there if there are important secrets on your mobile device. There are, it's a pain, but there are actually physical devices that will store your secrets that you can attach to the device. So it's basically like a second factor, but it's kind of like the old RSA keys. I don't know if probably some of you have seen them. It's a similar concept. It's a little memory card. It's a separate piece of hardware. If that piece of hardware is not connected to your phone, it's not going to allow the 2-factor to launch. So basically, it's called YubiKey. There's a couple of them out there, but certainly that's good. Is there a C system for storing passwords? Yeah, so there definitely are. Now, I think the main issue is convenience. So there's probably 3 or 4. I mean, there's more than that, but there's like there's 1Pass, there's Keeper. So there are apps today that exist. Most of them the good ones are paid. So you pay like $20, $30 a year, and what it will have is it'll have a secure store of your passwords. A lot of them are 2-factor, of course. So there'll be it's the same solution for your mobile device and your browser. So basically, once you remember that super complex password that you set up, and you set up your 2-factor to your phone to get a text message, you'll have access to your password store. So that's something that I adopted about 4 years ago. So I've got a password store which stores all of my website addresses. My website accounts and passwords are all complex, so they're all 20-digit random passwords that I don't even know. I just know my password for my password keeper. And that's certainly something that we see a lot of administrators use as well. So yeah, that's typically what we see in most organizations. They'll have like a keeper or a password. There's about 3 or 4 of them. I would say it's worth it to splurge and get a paid version, because some of the free password keepers over time have vulnerabilities. So often, the developers just don't have the motivation to continually test their systems and update them. So it's worth it to kind of pay the $20 and get that security. Right. Okay. And then there's people dropping off. So I don't know if are there any other common holes you find? Okay. Common holes in existing backup strategies. Yeah, absolutely. So if I go back to my example of that manufacturer with operations in Canada, US, and Mexico, they had a backup strategy, but they never did a restore. So they were making backups constantly. So in their case, they had hourly backups, they had daily backups and weekly backups, but they never actually did a restore. So, so what the hackers did is they infected the backups as well. So the backups were also had the malware. So when they tried to restore from the backups, the malware activated. So really, an effective backup strategy has to retain all the data that's important to you. So you have to decide, how often do I need to do the backup? Is it hourly, daily? How much time can I lose? Can I lose a day's worth of data being entered or an hour? And it's really important to do the restore. So you get a tester backup, and that takes a lot of time. It usually means at least do a partial recovery. So at least try and recover one server, once a month for sure, just to make sure the backup is correct. And at least annually, you should do a complete restore. So you start from basically assume all your servers have been destroyed, and then take all your backups and try and rebuild your infrastructure. That's a very time-consuming exercise, and most companies don't do that. But for sure, if you just think of your own personal data, whatever it is, photos, things that are of value for you. So if you've just been backing up and you've never made sure that data is still there, that's where there's a risk for sure. Okay. Yeah. So lots of good ones. The myth around the credit card being wrapped in tinfoil. Yeah, they actually they don't even have to brush up against your card to read it. So we had one of our hackers that built a directional antenna, and so he could actually read the credit card details, not all the time, but if it was at the right angle in your wallet or your purse, he could read the card at about a distance of about 3 meters. So he was able to read credit cards numbers for about 3 meters, which is pretty shocking. But what we find usually is it's more common to try and get a large number of cards. So if they're doing that, they're typically targeting like the gas station. So they'll put a reader on top of where, on top of the actual pump. So they'll have the pump, and they'll try and put a reader there. So as you're putting in your card to tap, it has a better chance of reading multiple cards. But yeah, it definitely is a risk. And it hasn't, I think it's made it more of a target for the hackers, because now the limits have been increased because of, a lot of merchants weren't allowing the PIN to be entered. So they increased the limits on the card. So that's made it an even more attractive target for the hackers. And is there another one? Oh, I think that's, I know. So Sarah, I don't know, do we go back to you now, or? It looks like such great questions. Yeah, Craig's got lots of questions. Good. So hopefully I answered most of the questions, Craig and others, but if you have any others, let me know.
Well, I guess I would like to thank Tom for his enlightening talk on systems and challenges in the world of online payment and data. Certainly, I think it's asked a lot more questions. I think, Tom, you delivered a pretty great discussion on it. And again, of course, you've left everyone wanting more, which is always the way that the best presenters work. So obviously, we'll have to get you back at some other point to do that and find out really some best practices that we need to be doing and doing every day. So this is the great part of today's session. And of course, FBA Atlantic is very much part of that process of helping try and support our members and bringing experts like you to talk to us and to have the discussions with that. And certainly we provide these continuing webinars on an ongoing basis, and we continue to do that throughout the coming months. So Tom, again, thank you very much for your interesting talk. And again, we want more, I guess, at some point. So
okay. Well,
we'll certainly get you back again. So
I'd love to actually have some lobster, and the next time for sure. I'm missing lobster. I was able to get some oysters, my hand on some New Brunswick oysters last couple of weeks, and we've been there. I don't know if it's I don't know. This is the one good thing about the pandemic. I think the demand is down, so the oysters are really cheap. So we've been feasting on oysters for a week now. So yeah. Anyway, next time, yeah, we're seafood fans for sure. I'd love to do this in person next time.
we can virtually eat it in front of you. I'm sure we could probably arrange that. That would be the other option, of course, but that would be tempting, Or we can arrange a shipment to come to your home office. There we go. That would be the thing.
All right.
There we go.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you very much again, and that will conclude the session. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.